The term I like to call visceral fat is invisible obesity. So it's the notion that you're obese, but you're invisibly so. You cannot see it. It's this type of fat that's deep in your abdomen. So why is it different and why is it bad? What makes it worse than subcutaneous fat, the stuff on the outside? Well, it's because the nature of visceral fat is it's secretory. It secretes inflammatory substances, particularly like IL-6, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, adipokines, cytokines, chemokines, these biochemical substances that get released by these particular types of fat cells that are highly inflammatory over a period of time. So a very interesting point that has to be made with regard to visceral fat is, I could take you, Jesse, put a bunch of visceral fat inside your abdomen, and there wouldn't be immediate change. It would happen over a period of time as you're exposed to that, sort of like radiation, or a good example is arsenic. Arsenic can kill over a slow period of time you get exposed to it, but a small exposure doesn't do much harm. Visceral fat is the same way. So the two deciding factors with regard to how much it hurts your health are how much you have and how long you've been exposed to it. So if you are pretty healthy your whole life, and then and we'll get into what causes visceral fat, and suddenly at the age of 50 or 30 or 70, you accumulate a huge amount of visceral fat, no big deal for a short period of time. But the longer you hold on to it, the worse off you are. And that's why you see these people that gain a lot of weight and lose weight, and they're like do fitness channels and they show that they recover pretty nice. That's because they get rid of that visceral fat in a short period of time. But there are consequences over the longer you have that, and they can be very severe. So the other interesting point to make about visceral fat is it is the first expression of disease that we found inside the body that basically says where humanity goes wrong. And we saw it in children that we scanned as young as 4. And so the more those kids ate, like processed foods, waffles, pancakes, sugary cereals in the morning, syrup and things like that, the more visceral fat they would accumulate. And so it's the same thing with adults. The more processed foods you eat, the more visceral fat you're going to get deposited within you. And the last point I'll make as far as an introduction about visceral fat is to whet your audience's appetite. Nothing that I'm aware of as a physician whose passion is to help people become the best biological versions of themselves possible, to optimize their health. And nothing is more valuable to eliminate than visceral fat. Nothing. Nothing else. Following nothing else. Everything else is less effective to improve a human being than following visceral fat and getting rid of it. So it's a really important area, and it starts with where it is, understanding it, why its nature is so bad.
All right, there's a lot we can get into there. That was a great overview. You talked about the chemical aspect, the fact that it's causing these inflammatory molecules to circulate the body and cause different problems. I'm curious about the actual structure, the physical structure of this fat. Looking at the picture there, it looks like it's strangling all the organs in the abdominal cavity. So is there a physical challenge with this as well, or is it all chemical?
Yeah, well, that is interesting. That's a very insightful question. So there is a physical component to this, and strangling is a pretty good word. Recently, I was researching liposuction. Liposuction is a surgical procedure where you remove fat from the abdomen, and that procedure just eliminates this fat here, on the outside, subcutaneous fat, and it doesn't remove this because it's super hard to mechanically, physically remove this. A surgeon has to work extremely hard to get rid of it. It is like entangled. It's adherent. It resists. It just is like cancer. It's so stuck in there that it's too dangerous to try to eliminate. But easy peasy for the body to get rid of it once you start living a healthy lifestyle. So that's what I specialize in, how you get rid of visceral fat. But the physical properties really are not that contributory, except it's hard. You can't surgically remove it. And a lot of people think if I've got a belly that's sticking out, I've got a lot of visceral fat. It has less to do with the mechanical properties of, let's say, accumulating visceral fat sticking out your body, and it has more to do with the biochemical properties, those inflammatory substances that travel through your body and make your muscles work less good. So we'll get into an image of this with the dad bod, but the dad bod is less the problem with accumulated visceral fat and more the problem of the exposure of those chemicals and those cytokines and those inflammatory molecules, weakening the abdomen to the point that man or woman who may have I don't know what the equivalent of a dad bod is, a mama bod. A lot of women think their belly sticks out because they've had a lot of babies. It really has more to do with visceral fat weakening their abdominal muscles. I can show you lots of women that are multiparous that have had lots of babies, completely flat abdomens, and the reason they never had visceral fat. They didn't accumulate it, and hopefully we'll get a picture of that. But let me show you a nice picture of two contrasting abdomens. Okay, so it's helpful for people who have no awareness of visceral fat. Well, to be able to look at an MRI scan, say they get one, and how what does a good MRI scan look like and a bad MRI scan in terms of visceral fat? And the reason why I do this with my clients is because, unfortunately, I'm not kidding. It's not taught in medical school. So radiologists don't know about this and don't read it. You will have an abdominal CT and you can pull it, pull any report. If you ever could find one, I'd love to hear from anybody, but nobody ever has. Find a single report of your abdominal CT or MRI and you'll see it never even comments on visceral fat, even though it's the biggest thing inside that abdomen. It's never read. And it's also the most important thing that should be read. It's completely ignored. So this is a really healthy abdomen. It's oval shaped, so it doesn't look like a dad bod. The dark structures on the sides, the muscles, are prodigious. They're massive. They're large. They're healthy. And they're also devoid of white. No white is in there. So those muscles are very lean. They're not afflicted with infiltrating inflammatory fat, what I call human marbling. Now, these muscles down here are small, these oblique muscles, and you can see those white streaks. Maybe if I blow it up a little bit more and pull it up, you can see these white streaks in those dark structures. That is marbleization of this guy's muscle, and he's turned it into basically like a ribeye steak. It's inflammatory. And we kind of laugh about it. We even think marbleized steak is good. It's not. That's a diseased cow. And when we see it in humans, it's a diseased human being. And it's always accompanied by all this white inside, the visceral fat. And is completely ignored now by radiologists and even orthopedic surgeons. My best friend in the world is an orthopedic surgeon, and he has, throughout his whole career, ignored marbleization in fat because it just wasn't part of his training. And now I've gotten convinced of how bad this visceral fat is, and now he's tracking that it always causes this. So the other defining feature is it shrinks these muscles. See how small this guy's muscles are? And look how big this guy's muscles are. So when you get a lot of visceral fat, it starts shrinking your muscles. So a big problem in America today is sarcopenia. That's a big word. We also call it in medical lingo, medical frailty. The other layman's term for this is your muscles shrink. And your muscles not only shrink in their mass, in terms of how much muscle tissue you have, but in their performance. So even if you have the same amount of muscle, your muscles are also not performing as well. So why is this a problem? Because nobody's addressing it. And it's what the bottom line of sarcopenia is, you can't do this. When you get to be a certain age, you're like this, struggling to get out of a chair. And eventually you need help. And eventually you're stuck in a wheelchair or a hospital bed and you just can't get out. You're stuck in there. So sarcopenia is a form of chronic disease that is from ignored visceral fat. And ignored, the technical term for this fat in the muscle is myosteatosis. So I like to give an example of what looks good, example of what looks bad, to educate people, and then to really hit this home, Jesse, so people understand this relationship between visceral fat and other forms of disease in the body. This is, again, mostly white in this particular scan here. You can see there's a lot of visceral fat in there. And then look at the person's legs that we scanned at the same time. And I'm just going to try to focus in on those legs. And what you can see in those legs see all the white streaks?
Yeah.
So that's that inflammatory fat being laid down in this muscle tissue. Now, right now, I know what's going on in your mind. Jesse's wondering, I wonder if I got that. That doesn't look good. You've never been to medical school, and you just looked at that, and you're wondering, do I have that fat in my muscle? And you don't want it. What you really want to have is this guy's legs. Look at these beautiful legs. Not a streak of fat in them. It's filet mignon. This is beautiful muscle because these legs belong to this abdomen. And this abdomen, look at the muscles in that abdomen. That there is the finest abdomen this MD researcher has ever laid eyes on. The healthiest human being I've ever seen. He's an Olympic sprinter, fantastically healthy. And so when we started to research the reversal chronic disease, informed our objective to approach the National Science Foundation for funding on a study on developing the best strategies and identifying the best targets to reverse chronic disease. We honed in on this biomarker of visceral fat and a particular strategy using sprinting. So look at the beautiful muscles this guy has. So the bottom line is, if you're listening today and you're at all interested in being the ultimately healthy person, then you want to have the smallest amount of visceral fat or no visceral fat possible. And you want to have the healthiest muscles possible that are devoid of this fatty infiltration. And you want to get yourself educated in this. So spend a little time here at the beginning to explain, the good and bad, the relationship between visceral fat and the muscles. And the other comment I would have is extraordinarily different as these two exams are. Like, first of all, this guy here, the radiologist should look at their cell phone, call them up and say, hey, I never talk to people that I scan, but I want to talk to you because I want you to tell me, what do you do? How do you live? What do you eat? How do you exercise? Because I want to be like you. And this guy, he should call up and say, my God, you're on the verge of potentially having a heart attack or developing cancer because you have such dangerous elevated levels of visceral fat. And I just want to warn you, I want you to immediately go to your doctor and start working on getting rid of your visceral fat. But none of those conversations happened. Instead, both of these scans were read as normal. And they couldn't be further from normal. And that's what I do. I specialize in trying to look at these important biomarkers, educating people, and trying to break through the morass of conventional healthcare, which just chases disease that we can make money from. There's no current treatment programs for visceral fat. It's all lifestyle. There's no medications. There's no surgical procedures. And that's why it's ignored.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
I want to knock their socks off. So when they do the strategies I tell them to do, they see that visceral fat is gone. This doubles your risk for death from a heart attack or stroke.